Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to kind of a part two to Metaphysics and the Malpass William and Craig debate that was on Modern Day Debates channel the other day. Now, I did a part one. That was basically more about the maths involved a little bit, although we didn't get too much into like explaining the math as much as I'd like to. But we had Cheshire and Great Land and Kurt Noll on, and we were talking about infinities and set theory and bijunctions and surjunctions and injunctions and all kinds of mathematical stuff, which was pretty fun. Hopefully later on, maybe we can actually go on the Great Debate Community channel and really dive into those topics a little bit more and explain mathematically what it means to map from a domain to a codomain, what it means to have a bijection mathematically. There's some mathematical notation for it. And I think that's kind of an interesting subject for people like set theory. So we'll probably do that. But anyways, we're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff. I think this particular Axis of Philosopher, I got some. This is not Nick, by the way, as people may notice. If it is, it's a much younger version of Nick, because I usually have Nick Suter on because he's a philosopher. But I've got the wonderful Mjdamore. I don't know if you guys really know who MJ is, but I got to tell you, I've known MJ for like what 6 years maybe. Oh, you can unmute, by the way. You can speak. You have my permission.
Sorry. Yeah, I think 2014-ish, something like that.
I can get rid of my echo. One sec. I forgot about that. My bad.
Oh,
Echo's gone.
Echo is gone. 2014-ish, circa.
Yeah, circa.
AD or CE, whatever you
And
want.
you were just getting in. Well, I mean, you had been into philosophy back then. But you were still
Yeah,
in school, if I'm not mistaken, weren't you?
I was in the military, so I was kind of like sandwiched between the masters and the bachelors,
Gotcha.
chilling on my lily pad.
But we do go way back. We love talking about philosophy. I read some of your stuff. I don't understand any of it, so that means it's good.
No.
He thinks that's bad. He thinks like, well, if you don't understand it, I didn't do it right. No, that's good. I want stuff that I don't understand. So, but anyways, welcome. By the way, if you want to tell people about yourself who don't know you, because again, you haven't been around much, and
Yeah, I know. Can I do the shameless plug?
yeah, shame. Never
Yes, let's put
shame,
it in the
man. Go
description.
nuts.
So I stink at advertising. So we got a new YouTube channel with a friend of mine from graduate school named Chris, and a guy I just met, joined us, named Zach, and it's called Democracy of the Dead. And we got 41 subscribers. Come over, subscribe, please.
There you go. Shout
Anyway,
out, call out, subscribe.
we
Um,
talk about philosophy.
since everybody's been
Um,
in like a quarantine situation, YouTube has not been doing
yeah.
notifications right. I've
Oh,
talked to numerous people. I've heard a lot of people that are content creators say this. They're not getting notifications out. They're not getting in the subscription feeds. They're getting a fraction of the views that they're
right,
used to be getting. And I think that YouTube is probably throttling their bandwidth, and I think
right.
it's probably something on purpose. If you're having a subscription problem, I've heard that this helps if you unsubscribe and then resubscribe. So give that
Sounds
a
good.
shot. But anyways, so you watched a little bit about the debate the other day.
A little bit, right. I looked at it a little before right now. I just listened to some chunks, mostly Malpass, just because I think I already know what Craig's going to say.
Yeah, and you're by the way, you're
And
like me. You're a pretty big fan of Malpass, right? All cards on
oh,
the table.
Malpass
Yeah,
he's awesome.
yeah,
I love Malpass. I guess he did his PhD in tensed logic. I haven't actually looked at the dissertation, but he's awesome. He's a cool guy to talk to.
yeah, and very down to earth, and he's very non-aloof, right? I mean, he doesn't
Right.
like talk down to people. He wants to explain things.
No.
Now, is he a little bit verbose? I mean, I think my only criticism of Malpass, and this is all cards on the table because I talked to Malpass a lot, and he's just way too nice in these discussions. I mean, I love him, but he's so freaking. I mean, like he was so nice to Darwin's, and it's like, oh man, it's cringe
I,
when he's so
I
nice.
get along with Darwin's deity perfectly. Like I've never gotten in an argument. I actually make him laugh. He loves me.
Well, I know somebody made him laugh one time, and he blocked him the next time he saw him. So I don't know.
Oh
He's
no,
very mercurial like that.
a little rough around the edges.
Hmm. But
Um,
you know what they were talking about though the Kalam cosmological argument, which by the way they didn't really get into that much.
right. It was just one of the philosophical arguments for the second premise
Yeah, yeah,
of the Kalam, right?
yeah.
So
So
the one, but
yeah,
it
go
spilled
ahead.
over in both of them. In both of them. So the metaphysical impossibility of an actual infinite, and the metaphysical impossibility of traversing an actual infinite via successive addition. So the second one kind of grants okay, let's just give it to you for the sake of argument, and let's just see whether or not it's metaphysically possible for you to traverse or to reach today or something like that. Yeah. So it just touched on those two, which is actually my favorite part of the argument.
Yeah,
And I
this
remember
goes.
bringing this up to you back in the day, and
Yeah,
you
yeah.
kind of like,
It goes.
yeah, I'm skeptical, man.
It go well because of the actualities of actual infinities existing. But yeah, it's like the Grim Reaper paradox they were talking about, right?
Yeah, I'm a little familiar with that.
And so where do you strand on this? Because again, yesterday we were talking about the math. We got some into the metaphysics of what it means to like persist through time and endure versus endure. Whether we cease to exist from one moment to another, are we the same person as we were 10 minutes ago? Because we actually have different properties, right? I'm in a different space time part of the universe as I was, just a few seconds ago, right? So am I the same person? If things have changed about me, am I the same person? The academic skeptics had argued that no, you're a new person moment to moment. The universe is created de novo every second, every well they didn't know what a Planck time was, but that was the general the idea behind it. And as you said, this whole notion of getting to infinities, adding one, additional. We talked about the Hilbert's paradox of the Hilbert's Hotel, or the paradox of the Hilbert's Grand Hotel. But where do you stand on it? Because I really didn't understand what the crux of their argument differentiation was, because I didn't know who was arguing what side at some point. I reached out to Malpass and I said, what are you arguing about this, as opposed to what is William Lane Craig arguing about what it means to be a countable infinity. To me, a countable infinity just merely means that it has to have a one-to-one bijection to the natural numbers. Okay,
that's what countable.
Yeah, that's formal.
That's it.
So if that's the case, one of them was talking about you not be able to count it in real time, not be able to reach ever infinity, because you can't count to infinity, but it's still considered an uncountable infinity set. And I don't know which one was arguing against or for that. Did you watch that part?
From what I could gather, I don't think it came up. And this is kind of relevant for the ad hominem point that they were making, as far as I could make out. I don't know where Alex stands on the metaphysical possibility of an actual infinite, because it seems like Alex's dialectical strategy was basically to just say, let's just grant that a beginningless series of events is a species of an actual infinite. Let's just grant that. And if it is, then you have this symmetrical problem with an endless future. And so whether or not well, actually, he might endorse some kind of absurdism, because he said that he had that analogy with quantum mechanics where he just said, if these absurdities are what are implied by an actual infinite, then he kind of took the tack of Graham Oppy, where Graham Oppy's just like, this is just what we would expect, these kind of absurdities to just be implied by these Hilbert Hotel type thought experiments or something like that. Oppy. So it just. Well, Oppy's awesome. He's like the Elvis Presley of atheist philosophy.
But when you call it absurdism, absurdism to me is basically Kierkegaard's approach. That's
his existentialism.
Yeah, existentialism. Right? The tension between man's search for meaning of life and not finding it is what would be that the universe has no intrinsic value or meaning or like that. That to me is what I would fall under absurdism. Right, the universe is absurd because we look for meaning. That's our human nature, but we're doomed not to find it. It's the way I look. Okay. So what they're talking about, the actual infinities, I don't know where it stands either. Now, I do agree that I think it would be odd to have an asymmetrical system in the universe where you had some beginning, you had an end without a beginning, or beginning without an end. I think that if you have a beginning, it seems to be the case. Well, actually, no. What was they were talking about the asymmetrical, right?
Yes.
So the universe had a beginning in it. No. That, by the way, I think that only does follow a theory of time, a tensed theory of time, rather than a tenseless, a B theory. But when was Malpass arguing against an asymmetrical? Like, if you had a beginning, you had to have an end, or if you have an end, you have to have a beginning. And I think if you have an end, you have to have a beginning, but not so much the converse. But then I think of like a ray. A ray has a point, which is the beginning, and then goes on to infinite. And since in like physics, time doesn't matter directionality wise. The laws of physics are the same backwards and forwards. So I mean, if you have a beginning and then no end, it would make sense you have no end, but you have a beginning, which would be the Terminator if you just reverse time. So I don't know what he meant by the asymmetrical causality there.
I think one of the points of contention between Craig and Malpass was this issue of whether or not, if you do have a beginning and no end, that commits you symmetrically as it would with a no beginning and an end. to an endless future. And then the further point that Craig was trying to push Alex on as far as shouldering the burden of proof for motivating the idea that if you do have a beginning point and no end, that is a species of an actual infinite, that it's not a potential infinite. And Alex was trying to locate the potential infinite in the future perfect. And so you will never have an actual infinite number of marbles. So these marbles that were coming into being ex nihilo, and then Alex would grab the marble and put it into the jar. It will never be the case that it will have been the case that you will have an actually infinite number of marbles in that jar. But the number of marbles that will be in the jar will be actually infinite. And what Craig was trying to say is that there are species of having a beginning and no end that doesn't commit you to that kind of endless future. Because of the ad hominem nature of Alex's objection, there was no objection against the metaphysical possibility of an actual infinite. So if those arguments go through and it is metaphysically impossible for there to be an actual infinite, then you can have a beginning point and no end and not be committed to the idea that there are an actually infinite number of things that will be. That it will be a potential infinite for the future perfect, and for just the simple future.
And the future perfect is something like it will be, or it
will happen. It will happen.
Yeah. So I will have then completed my task by that time. As a future perfect is a futuristic statement of saying I will. I have. What is it? I will have. Yeah.
Yeah. I will have put whatever marbles end up in the jar. I will have put them in there.
If you're counting to infinity, right? If you're doing that, and I didn't see any argument for a metaphysical possibility of things like an infinite regress or an actual infinity, because that would mean, as I think Craig pointed out, it could not exist in any logical possible world, right? I mean, and that's a big burden to carry. If you say that it isn't logically impossible, you have to show logically that it cannot exist in any possible world, right?
It would be a broad kind of possibility. So, but it would have, this gets into possible world semantics. And according to like David Lewis and Robert Stallnacher, they have like the kind of monopoly on. Realist, but their semantics are kind of compatible with realist or anti-realist construals of the possible worlds. Even Plantinga cites, I think, the Stallnacher semantics in some of his later essays after he published The Nature of Necessity. So you can actually use the semantics and just say, okay, I'm not going to be ontologically committed in the way Lewis is. But
yeah, he has a good argument for ontological commitment for
he does. He uses different explanatory virtues and stuff like that, unification and all that stuff. But so there's a distinction between strict, narrow, broad, and metaphysical, and then nomological possibility. I think what Craig's trying to say is that the actual infinite is metaphysically impossible, in that you pick all the worlds that are maximally consistent sets of states of affairs or propositions, and then they have the further property of actualizability. So there might be some possible worlds out there that are broadly logically possible, where you actually have an actual infinite, but they're not actualizable.
Yeah,
now, there are some people like Michael Lux, Lux, that actually think that broad and metaphysical are actually the same thing.
What would make something
not
actualizable? Because, I mean, again, the way I understand possible world semantics, and I know a little about Lewis and stuff, but the way I'm not ontologically committed to modal realism. I do tend to anti-realism, although I think Lewis makes some good arguments. But what would make a possible world such that it has a possibility to be metaphysically possible, but not actualizable? And what we mean by that to the outside people is this world that we live in is the actualized world. There's only one actualized world, and that's the one that you're in. That's indexical. Right. Whatever one you're in, that is the actualized world. Now, if there's other worlds that could have been actualized, these are possible worlds that God could have created instead of this one, right? Mm-hmm. And why is he arguing, or one of them arguing, that if that's the case, God could not have actualized even if he wanted to one of those possible worlds? Right. And this one maybe is a metaphysical necessity of some kind?
Yes. Yeah. So there's a really good essay that probably a lot of people know about. It's by Thomas Flint and Alfred Freddoso, called Maximal Power. This kind of got the conversation going. It was published in 1983, and it gives you this kind of analysis of the attribute of divine omnipotence in terms of a being's ability to actualize states of affairs. It was like the first one to kind of do this. And he had other analyses that came by. But they have these conditions that are in their conceptual analysis, and you can just pick one to illustrate like a possible situation where something's broadly logically possible, but it's not metaphysically realizable. So one of the things they bring up that you probably heard a billion times are counterfactuals.
Yeah, of course.
Counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. There's also tensed propositions, like changing a hard fact about the past, which brings up another can of worms. But so these propositions, though contingent, they serve as like metaphysical constrictions on what God can or cannot actualize. So if it is the case that if, like, let's say before, any worlds are actualized, if it is the case that if Steve were in a specific set of circumstances, he would freely invite Mjdamore to come on his show, then that proposition right there is true. And the truth conditions for the proposition are just involve the fact that you would freely do that had your essence been actualized in those specific sets of circumstances. Now, because it's true, and the truth conditions only involve whatever you would freely do in those circumstances, and it's not contingent upon what God would actualize, then it's true independent of the decree. It's independent of God's will. In the same way necessary truths are. So in the same way, if you're not like Descartes, right? So if you don't think everything's possible. But so in just the same way that particular proposition, that counterfactual proposition, could be a part of what Plantinga calls a book, and a book is just a maximally consistent set of propositions. If you deny that, if you deny the consequent and you keep the antecedent, and you say, if Steve were freely in C, then he would not invite Matt on his show freely, right? That doesn't violate any kind of thesis in first order logic. So you could actually substitute that proposition out for the one that wouldn't be the case had it been actualized, and it'd still be a maximally consistent set of propositions. It's just when God goes to make that world, the one where we're in right now, happens to unfurl. Right, exactly. It doesn't have the property of actualizability because it's not the way you would freely act.
All right, so let's dive into that. That's not the direction I was going to go, but I find this fascinating. Okay, so counterfactual condition is a condition that what would have been a possible would have been case.
The false antecedent.
The issues I have with counterfactuals, and again, this is the subjunctive case, right?
Exactly.
The problem I have with counterfactuals is that while they're great to discuss and possible semantic and all those things, what is the truth maker that exists in a counterfactual condition?
They deny.
Yeah.
So all of them deny truth maker maximalism. So truth maker maximalism means that you got a truth maker for any kind of true proposition whatsoever. Now, there's some people that actually believe that you do need truth makers for certain types of propositions, but not for other kinds.
Yeah, I'm falling into that.
They motivate arguments that all you need to explain the truth value of these counterfactuals are truth conditions only, not truth makers. So if these truth conditions have like a truth maker that would be a counterpart, right, if the subjunctive was turned into an indicative, had God chosen to instantiate that particular proposition, then you could have that indirect kind of truth maker. Just it doesn't exist yet, but it will exist once the world unfurls in a certain way, so that when it comes time to make that action, you freely, undertake your action in correspondence with the content of the counterfactual.
And that's kind of I'm kind of tending that to myself. I mean, deflationary theory, has to quit, kind of thing. I think that when you say that there has to be a truth maker for a proposition, there isn't always a case where there's going to be a truth maker. I think truth conditions might satisfy certain propositions, just the whole that they have truth, especially when you start dealing with whether it's truth enough to consider it knowledge, right? Okay, so these possible worlds that are potentialities that God could not instantiate to make it actualized on these counterfactual conditions. How would have Lewis actually have addressed that? Because he would have argued, because each modal world, each possible world has ontology, they are, in a sense, actualized to whatever being is inside that actual world.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, and I think Robert Adams has some essays on this, I think this is just a problem for a view called serious actualism, where you're only committed to one actual world.
Okay.
But if you have Lewis's modal realism, then whatever's actual is just purely indexical. Like it's actual to world one if you're an inhabitant of world one. But we're an alpha, so alpha's actual. But it's like here. There's no objective here, like what Craig was saying with Alex. It's just here.
I had a chance
it's a de se property, I think they say. De se.
De se. De re, de dicto, de se.
Yeah.
By the way, I've caught up on this stuff. May not be real books,
You're the man,
but
dude.
I have read over the last 6 years. You'd be
These may not be
surprised.
real books.
Not real books, but I have read. So I do know these discussions. I didn't want to look an idiot like I used to be 6 or 7 years ago when I used to say philosophy. Who knew that? Who needs that, right? But now I can have a decent conversation, I guess. Now I lost where I was trying
My
to go.
background sucks. Oh my gosh.
Oh, what was I going to ask? I totally lost where I was going. Oh yeah, I had an opportunity to correspond with Dr. Graham Priest, if you know who he is.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah,
Dialect.
yeah. So he's an expert on modal logic and theism and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I had actually been a chance to ask him a question because it was came up in the Great Debate community. People might recognize MJ. MJ was in the Great Debate community for since time began.
I was a wallflower.
Yeah. He went under the different names, which we won't get into because
Slash.
yeah, slash. And you had a picture that I think was either Rembrandt's. It was similar to Rembrandt's picture, wasn't it?
It was as close as I could get to the boat that Goodwill Hunting's looking at with Robin Williams. You know what I mean?
But I had asked him. I said, okay, so what would have Lewis said to the argument that if you're committed to modal realism, that these possible worlds have ontology? If a person can think of a god, a god in a possible world that has to exist in some possible world, it doesn't have to be all of them. It doesn't have to be metaphysical necessity, right? But if you're committed that it's contingent and it must exist in one possible world and not necessarily another, at least, are you then a theist? And he argued, actually, yes. And I said the same thing.
Right.
My argument was exactly the same that he put it. The conditions of believing in a God that exists is the existence itself, not necessarily in the actualized world, but if it's a possible world that has ontology, that is realized,
right.
that would be you are logically committed to say yes. Then I believe that gods exist. They just don't happen to exist in this actualized world. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it follows.
Yeah, and he said Lewis probably would have thought
Lewis's
the same
modal
thing. I
realism.
think he said that Lewis said the same thing. So.
Which is interesting because he was really interested in the ontological argument. So I wonder if he was kind of looking around in that logical space for different implications of his view. That's interesting.
I thought that was awesome. So
yeah, me too.
So going back real quick to the actual infinities, we kind of diverged from that because people have a hard time understanding the difference between actual infinity and potential infinity. I thought Malpass did a really good job describing them.
Yeah, I did too.
One's over a period of time. One's like, do you want to kind of tell people the difference between an actual infinity and a potential infinity?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that really helped me is just to say that the actual infinite is a number and the potential infinite is not. I start right there. And then I go, what kind of number is the actual infinite? It's a transfinite number. It's not one of the numbers in the set of all the natural numbers. It stands outside the set, and it's like a second order property of everything in the set, and it tells you that there's aleph null or aleph naught numbers in that particular set of natural numbers, and they're countable because there's a 1-to-1 correspondence between the natural numbers. Natural numbers are countable.
All right, let's dive into that real quick. Okay, and I agree.
Okay.
So it is a transfinite number. It doesn't exist in the real set. Okay.
Exactly.
So it'd be outside the real set.
No predecessor.
Yeah, and so you couldn't work with it with like binary operators and like that. But it is treated as there's a cardinality involved. Okay, so when he's talking about alpha null, that is a cardinality that exists, which is your smallest amount of infinite set, and that would be considered the naturals. So n, they call that n. In fact, when they were talking yesterday about n, they're talking about the set of natural numbers. That's what the n is referring to in that particular discussion. This is why yesterday when we were talking about math, I wanted to talk a little about the math first before we started talking about the
I would love that.
Because I don't know if you don't know if you watched it yesterday, but I thought it would be better to kind of explain to people what the hell they were talking about.
Yes,
then
I agree.
Review the debate because they were talking in such a language with each other that I think, besides like Jack Ingstrike who was listening, and besides, a lot of the
Jack was?
Yeah. But besides the people that are really into the stuff, a lot of people I would expect the person to go, what the hell is alpha null, right? Or what the hell is cardinality? And I get that. So alpha null would be the set of natural numbers. It's the smallest amount of infinite set. And then alpha 1 would be the set of reals. That's the next higher order of infinity.
Mhm.
Okay, and then you have alpha 2 and 3 and so on.
Right. You got the
So,
diagonal argument.
yeah, Cantor's diagonal argument that if you have a list of numbers between the 0 and 1, that if you take the diagonal, that diagonal number will never appear on your list. And so there's always going to be a higher infinity. And
Right.
it's a proven argument. I mean, this is not even something that's questionable in math. It's
Right.
literally proven. But I agree with you. So if you're treating the actual infinity as a transfinite number, uh, that I think it does in some way commit you to mathematical Platonism in some way. And let me explain to you why. I think
Sure.
I tend to nominalism, but I think that if Quine's argument for the indispensability theorem is such that we use these
I hate it.
numbers. Yeah, but it seems pretty solid. It's a hard. I mean, Quine is not an easy read, and I'm not even going to say I'm
No,
going to
no,
tell you
no,
that I
no,
understand
no.
Quine.
Yeah, he
Quine
is
and
hard.
Sosa,
It's
Ernest
kind of
Sosa.
boring too.
But you can distill the gist of his argument down to
Yeah.
basically we use it, it's useful, we should treat them as real objects, right? In a nutshell,
Hmm.
would you say this? Indispensable. Math is indispensable to
Yeah,
science. Yeah.
well, sets are indispensable
Sets
to
are
the way you
indispensable. Yeah.
construe the quantifier. Right. Exactly.
So if you're
And
going
then
to
we
use this,
talked about last
go
time
ahead.
quantifier variance. Yeah.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Well, yeah, if you're going to use these quantifiers, then it makes sense to treat sets as actual objects, right? Would you agree?
If you are a quantifier invariant kind of person, where you just think there's only one possible interpretation of this quantifier,
Mm-hmm.
that you are just literally speaking committed to the values of the variables bound by the quantifier in these, existentially quantified statements. Yes, you are. It tells you what you are committed to if you want to make true statements about whatever you're talking about.
Now, let's say that it's not
And so
invariant. Let's say that they can represent
they
multiple
might not
things.
even exist. That's the thing. Like Van Inwagen talks about this. Like he's a neo-Quinian, but he just says that a misconception that a lot of ontologists have is that it actually is a proof for the existence of something, but it's actually just a schema or a way to let you know what you're actually committed to if you want to say true statements about something like that. So they might not even exist. But that's why I don't know if you've seen the debate between Van Inwagen and Craig, but Van Inwagen said this back to Craig a couple times. He's like, "Well, do you want me to say true things about the things I care about, or do you want me to contradict myself?"
Yeah, and
He would say that to Craig a couple times.
yeah, no, and it does really kind of give you to what you have to hold true. What it means to be true. And by the way, this is what we talked about with Landon yesterday. Landon is a diehard scientist, right? He's a mathematician. He's a scientist. He thinks that,
Awesome.
yeah. And I gotta respect it. He's the smartest guy I know. He doesn't think like a philosopher much. I've noticed that.
Which is okay. That's
Right, and
okay.
he even said there's a huge discrepancy between philosophers and science. And
Yes.
Landon does not like disagree with me. We don't have any disagreement on any of this.
Mhm.
But it's hard for him to like, for example, the conversation you're having from a philosophical point of view. I don't think that's his wheelhouse, right? I don't think he's going to be able
Yeah.
to do that. And
Yep.
that's what I was
Division of
yesterday. I
labor.
was like noticing. It's like, yeah, I was like, because I was like, let's get into some of this actual philosophical stuff rather than just the mathematical
Right.
respect of it. And it was kind of difficult, but I love that about Landon because he's a mathematician, right? And
That's awesome.
the
Yeah.
philosophy of math and math itself, even though they kind of deal with the same things, there seems to be a
Hmm.
fundamental distinction between them because like I don't think Landon would give a crap what you're ontologically committed to,
Nope. Yep. That's different.
right?
One's a first order discipline, and the other's a second order discipline. That's Ceti's the first order discipline.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And I think the second order stuff is fascinating, especially like when you're dealing with meta stuff. It's like
Yeah.
there's always
Meta
something
ontology,
above,
meta
yeah, a
metaphysics, meta
layer upon
philosophy.
layer.
Exactly.
And I love that, like supervenience, that you have something
Yeah.
here and it just seems to go into all the different subjects.
It's
Bottom up.
recursive.
It's fascinating. Yeah, that's one thing
It's
I love
awesome.
about philosophy.
Yeah, I agree.
So
I love meta philosophy. The higher the level of abstraction, the more I get
it's
pleasure
great.
from
And here's the thing.
it.
I didn't know where either of them stood. Well, I think William and Craig accepted, but I didn't know where Malpass stood on the acceptance of actual infinities. I don't know his stance on it.
Yeah, like I said, judging by that one part, it sounds like he was either flirting with it in terms of him not having a problem with it if he did think they were metaphysically possible, and just like this is just the way reality would be, and we shouldn't be surprised by these consequences, or he just was so kind of focused on the particular objections that are in the essay written by him and Wes Morstan that it kind of just got glossed over,
Hmm.
which was relevant to the ad hominem point
Now, can you
because
try
it
to relate
wasn't
it?
really,
Can you try to relate it back to the Kalam though? Um,
yeah.
because that's the whole point of the whole argument they're having is does the universe have a beginning? And I gotta tell you, I think it dives into. And I hate to use this word so much, but there's sometimes it's appropriate, and sometimes it's not a bad thing. but I think
Okay.
it gets into a lot of semantic stuff.
Sure. Definitely. There's semantics with some utility,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
and
I
then
know
there's
that.
hair splitting, annoying semantics. But yeah, so these two philosophical arguments that were brought up, I guess, broached by Craig, and then Alex was trying to not shoehorn, but dovetail his objections onto these two ways that Craig has to motivate the second premise. The argument as a whole is whatever begins to exist as a cause. You can reformulate that in different ways. The second premise is that the universe had a cause, or I'm sorry, universe began to exist. And the first philosophical argument is supposed to motivate that. It's supposed to make that premise more plausible than its denial. And just to say that if it is the case that the universe has always existed, then that is a species of an actual infinite because
Yes.
you have a beginningless series of events. It's a beginningless temporal regress. And the way Alex talks about this too, I love the way he kind of contrasts the wording of the dialectic. So, with the past, you got temporal regress. With what he was trying to say symmetrically about the endless future, it's a temporal progress. And he italicized pro in progress, which is awesome. That was appropriate, I think. So if a beginningless series of events is metaphysically impossible, and a beginningless series of events is a species of a actual infinite, then it follows that an actual infinite is metaphysically possible by modus
Sure,
ponens.
absolutely.
But the first premise needs to be motivated. And one of the ways you do this in the metaphysics of modality and trying to find out, in the discipline of modal epistemology, how it is modal truths, what gives you reason to think that particular modal propositions are actually possible, or what, is these thought experiments that are supposed to inflate your intuitions about what it is you would or would not accept in terms of the degree of absurdity that is a consequence of admitting this into your ontological storehouse or warehouse, or however you want to say it, on your catalog of what there is, as Quine would say. Do you want to admit this into your ontology? Because if you do, it has these weird, really counterintuitive consequences. If you're willing to swallow the consequences, then like what Craig said in his debate with Alex, then there's really nothing. There's nowhere you can go from there. He brought up the Wittgenstein quote about with David Hilbert saying, "No one can drive us out of this paradise," and Wittgenstein says, "Well, I mean, you can stay here if you want, but look how awful it is," and try to make you
You
lead
have to bite
through
the
these
bullet.
imaginative kind of scenarios. Exactly. And so this is a way. It's not a scientific methodology. It's a priori way of adjudicating the plausibility of giving certain modal propositions the idea of truth based on these different ways of inflating your intuitions about the proposition. And so if your intuitions are not moved, or they're deflated or inflated relative to whatever thought experiment you're talking about, uh, you're going to get into something that happens all the time in philosophy: intuition clashes,
All right.
right?
Well, I have.
And then
Okay, finish.
that's it. And so that would actually be a stalemate. So I wouldn't be able to persuade Alex out of whatever he's arguing, but he wouldn't be able to persuade me out of what I believe
Gotcha.
either.
I
But then
think
you go as far as you can go. Intuition clashes are very annoying, and
yeah,
you
because it's
try to
intuition.
tweak it. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And by the way, some intuition arguments are actually amazing because it shocks the senses kind of thing. But there's two
Right.
things I would try to kind of give a little pushback on all that. One, I'm not convinced that a logical regress is impossible. Matter of fact, Agrippa trilemma, the Munchausen trilemma allows it as one possible epistemic status for it's not an epistemic,
Infinitism.
a metaphysical status for grounding, right? You have either infinite regress, you have brute fact, or you have metaphysical necessity. Those are pretty much your three options, right? So
Yes.
I don't see a logical problem with infinite regress, and this is where I was trying to wrap my head around. You can have an
Hmm.
infinite regress, but now they're arguing about a logical, the problem with having a actual infinity. And you would, if you have an infinite regress and you have a universe that has existed, always, does that would become an actual infinity? And you are committed at that point to say that logical regress is clearly logically possible if you have an actual infinity. But I don't think that you can disprove this notion of having an infinite regress. I don't think it's impossible because it's part of the trilemma.
Yeah, so I would make a distinction between, in epistemology, where you have this kind of epistemic kind of transaction between whatever it is you believe in the ground on which you believe it, and then the ground for the ground and the ground for the ground and all that stuff. There's a couple different directions I would go. I would say you could either construe that in terms of a potential infinite,
Well,
right?
infinitism would be something similar along
I-
those
I-
lines.
Infinitism, exactly.
Yeah.
You could say that there is mathematical legitimacy to the actual infinite, that Cantor actually gave us a way to talk about the infinite that's not contradictory at all. It's
Hmm.
not contradictory in a narrow sense, where there's a violation of some thesis in first order logic. So you can actually endorse the logical coherence of infinitism, but still be committed to the metaphysical, more broad modality, the metaphysical impossibility of an
Uh,
actually infinite number of discrete and distinct events, objects, things, individuals, however you want to construe that ontology, of being metaphysically instantiable,
mhm.
of actualizability. So as long as you can uh, construe the logical coherence of the way of the gift that Cantor gave to us in order to talk about the semantics, I mean, it was absolutely brilliant. And you get rid of Quine's indispensability thesis. You can say so many true things about it and
It's
just not being ontologically committed to it and still be committed to the philosophical arguments motivating the second premise in the Kalam.
it blows your mind, right? It blows your mind when you start thinking
Yeah.
about this stuff. Just as it
Yes.
explained the
That's
Hilbert's paradox of the Grand Hotel, people have to wrap their minds around just a simple infinity. You just, something that's just what we mean by infinity, what people think of constitutes infinity, never ending. Uh, when you have an infinite set of something, people have a hard time wrapping their heads around that. I had explained yesterday that an infinite set minus an infinite set is undetermined, right? It's not zero. It's indetermined because, well, you don't even know what the elements of the
I
set
heard
are.
it's I heard it's prohibited. Division and subtraction are prohibited
They,
in set theory
here it
because it's meaningless,
the
right?
reason being is it's undefined and meaningless because you
Undefined.
don't know what you don't know what
Right.
you're dividing into, right?
Exactly.
Normally, you divide by zero is undefined for the rationals, right? I mean, it basically says that p over q, p or q has to be equal to um, p over q has to be um, what's the thing? It has to be greater than one. Uh, there's actually a formula to figure out
Like a
what actually.
non-empty set or
Yeah,
something.
so it's not. Yeah, so it's what defines a rational number. Um, but yeah, you can't divide by zero because it's undefined at when q is zero, it's undefined, right? You have a
Yeah,
yeah,
that's the way I heard that the prohibition is defined in terms of its indefinability.
yeah. I
That you
never
just
realized.
can't undertake the operation because you can only undertake definable operations.
Yeah, and it literally is defined to be that way in the rationals by q being p over the q
Ah,
set q over small p over
yeah,
small q, and q is not equal to zero. There is ways of
right.
doing division by zero, sort of, in some other types of what's called analytical continuation.
Oh,
Yeah, so I
okay.
mean, you can well, we know that, for example, like you've used La Hospital's rule, which is kind of a way to divide by zero, right? When you're working with limits, La Hospital rule.
You went way further than me in mathematics.
La Hospital's rule is a way to, when you have a division by zero in a
Okay.
denominator, when you're working with limits, it gives you a workaround to actually still determine what the limit
Oh,
would be,
cool.
approaching from the left hand side or the right hand side. But
Can I ask you a question?
yeah,
Do you know about the hyperreal numbers?
yeah, hyperreals are basically okay. So you have different types of sets. You have the real numbers, which are a
Right.
subset of the complex.
Correct.
You got the surreals.
Surreals,
You got the hyperreals, and
hyperreals.
then you have some all kinds of weird other stuff. But the hyperreals are basically, let's say I have like 0.99 repeating equals one.
Hmm.
Okay, there is no number next to one that is not one. I mean, there's no like,
Hmm.
there's nothing to say that if I say if I'm approaching one, what's the closest number to one that's not one? That does not exist, right? In the reals,
Hmm.
it's a continuum, but it
Yes.
doesn't have what's called a neighborhood. It doesn't have an infinitesimal because the only infinitesimal in the reals is considered to be zero because what's called the Archimedean principle. So the
Okay.
reals have no infinitesimals in them, but hyperreals allow for the case of infinitesimals. And the way that would work would be, for example, if it would be point like 99999 point dot 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 is equal to -1. That's that mathematically it seems to be works out for the hyperreals, if I remember correctly. But the hyperreals allow for infinitesimals that the reals do not allow for, basically.
Awesome.
Now,
Okay.
it goes way more into that, but that's the best way I can probably describe it. Just think of it
Okay.
as the reals do not allow for infinitesimals. Some people consider 0 to be an infinitesimal, but the reals are such that if x is less than y or greater than y, there must be a number divisible by 2 between them. So x plus y divided by 2 must exist for the reals. So if x does not equal y, then there must exist a real number between them. That's how it actually is defined in the reals as the continuum. Hyperreals have a whole different ballgame. You can have an infinitesimal that's next to the number that isn't the number, but isn't not the number kind of thing. So
I've been told by some of my mathematics friends that once you assimilate set theory into the hyperreal number system, that division and subtraction can almost go through and it's not undefined. And I was going to ask you if that's true.
I don't know about division and subtraction. I know that what's called the I think it's called not the transitivity property. It's a property that says
Commutative?
No. It holds that whatever's true for the reals holds true for the hyperreals. Now, normally for most groups, you have reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. Those are the three things that generally hold for most things. So basically, commutativity A times B, B times A, transitivity A equals B, B equals C. Some people know the basics like that, but there's a principle, and it starts with a T, and I can't remember what the hell it is, that if it holds for the reals, it also must hold for the hyperreals. It's not transitivity; it's the trans something. I've got mathematicians in the live chat. Come on, guys, help me out here. I mean, I could look it up, and I'm sure I'll find it in a second because I've actually wrote something on this before.
I'm trying to look it up. I don't even know where to go though.
I'll find it while you continue to discuss about this stuff. So again, going back to the debate, they're arguing that if you like the marbles, right? I start counting the marbles one by one. Now we all agree we're never going to reach the end of an infinite set. You can even though if there's a natural numbers of countability in that jar, we can count them. It's a countable infinity, but we'll never reach the end of it, right?
Yep.
So even though it's what they call countable infinity, all that means is a bijection to the naturals. It doesn't mean that you can actually do it in a finite time. You cannot. This is where
there's no number you will never count, but it doesn't follow from that you can count all the numbers. This was a key distinction that Craig. And that's an actual modal distinction I've read in a bunch of different places, but and I may be misunderstanding Alex. I want to be charitable towards him, but it didn't seem like he was going with the inference. I think it depends on the context of the modal context, whatever they're talking about.
Well, he said he might have had a modal scope fallacy.
It is a modal scope fallacy.
And I do love Alex. Don't get me wrong, but I was really thinking about this. It follows to me, and I should have asked Landon this the other day. If you have a countable infinity,
correct.
That just means that they are countable. They have one-to-one bijection. It doesn't mean that you're going to count every single individual one of them. That doesn't entail that at all. And William Lane Craig pointed that out, and I think he's right on that, of course.
Because there's properties that the elements of the set have that aren't shared by the whole set. Sure. So that's what Cameron brought up, the composition. It is a kind of composition fallacy. But the kind of composition fallacy it is a modal scope. It's an illicit shifting of modal scope.
Illicit, yeah, and that's what he implied. There was an illicit problem there.
But he disagreed, and I want to hear Alex out on that because
Alex did disagree. Yeah,
he disagreed with it. That was a point of contention.
And this is what people, people think we have like tribalism and stuff. I love Alex, and I would never, think.
Oh yeah. I would never.
But math
Alex
is math,
awesome.
right? And I'm not qualified to say that he messed up or not, right? But I mean, I was thinking about this just as much as some other people probably were, and I didn't want, as you said, principal charity. What was he meaning by this? Because I would think William Lane Craig made a great argument that it wasn't illicit, there was a modal scope fallacy, because just because you can count on the natural numbers does not imply that you can count every single one of them. And I think if I understood Malpass right, he disagreed with that.
He needs that for his argument that there's an implication between an endless future and an actual infinite.
Okay.
Because if it's the case that, and this was an undercutting defeater, I think, towards this future perfect, simple perfect distinction that he was making, because Craig said a couple times, I'm not even really, I mean, his language in some of his publications did bring up the future perfect. I admit that. But during the dialogue itself, I think what he was trying to say is, I'm not really dependent on that. Let's go with the simple perfect. That's totally cool. But even if we do, because of this modal scope fallacy, you're not going to get the consequence you need from an endless future to an actual infinite. Because all you get is, if there is no marble, individual marble that you will not put into the jar, it doesn't follow that you will put all of the marbles in the jar. Right. And you need to say that part. You need to have that implication between the properties of the elements and the property of the set to get this consequence or this implication between an endless future and an actual infinite. And the actual infinite, with the analogy, will correspond to all the marbles in the jar. But Alex is associating, he doesn't think you need all the marbles in the jar because he's trying to confine or locate the potential infinite with the future perfect only. And Craig is saying it doesn't matter. Let's go to the simple future. You'll never have all the marbles in the bar just because there's no marble that you will not put in the jar. It just doesn't follow modally.
Yeah, and I completely
and I
agree
think
with
that's
that.
a good point.
Yeah. So, I mean,
And
when a lot of people are saying,
I'm not trying to take sides at all.
no,
That's actually
this
modal.
is a review of the debate,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is what
Exactly,
we wanted to do yesterday. We didn't get this far into it.
Gotcha.
But this is what I kind of wanted to talk about because that's one of the things that I had noticed as well. And people say, like, I don't want to, William Lane Craig is so dishonest. And by the way, I think William Craig just wants to win a debate. But I don't think he lies, and I don't think he makes fabricated arguments. I think he really tries to make very solid arguments.
I hear the theses. I just see no evidence for it. I've known him. I've talked to him. He's a great guy. It just I read these tweets and I'm like, he's not being decided. He might make mistakes.
But what I'm saying is,
I see no evidence for it.
You got to admit, he is one of the most well-learned apologists out there.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, and so people, I think people underestimate that. And when they hear an apologist say something they don't understand, there's this Pavlovian knee-jerk reaction in the skeptic atheist community to say, oh, look, he's just like word salad or he's wrong. And that may not necessarily be the case, because here's a case that I don't think William Lane Craig necessarily was wrong. Matter of fact, it seemed like an illicit problem. It seemed like there's a modal scope fallacy here. And I would like to have suss that out more, and I'd like to have, Alex... I reached out to him prior to the debate. I'll try again. Maybe I'll ask about this because I said, what is the disagreement? But let me know what you find out about that. But I think people are way too dismissive just because people are not in the same tribe, right? And by the way, we got a super chat. Helios 575 for $10. In mathematics, specifically calc, infinite is treated as a number, kind of. Example: infinite minus any number would still be infinite, but infinite minus the sum of infinite plus 1 would be 1. Well, I would a little bit agree and disagree. Even in calc, infinity is not treated as a number. What it is called abusive notation, right? Infinity itself is not actually treated with what's called a binary operator, which means like something is acting upon two things. So if A times B times is actually a binary operator because I have two operands, right? You cannot say like 1 plus infinity in mathematics. It doesn't make any sense if you really think about it, because infinity.
It's still Aleph null.
Yeah, it's still you're still, the way I've always described it is anything you do to an infinite set, the set remains infinite, except in the case of infinity minus infinity, you have indeterminate, non-determinate, or undefined. I guess you should say there's a slight difference, but long story short, 1 minus infinity makes no sense. And so what mathematicians kind of do is they just treat it as an abusive notation to say, here, we're going to explain to you the concept, but the actual formula of 1 plus infinity is not mathematically correct, because infinity is not a real number. It's only treated as an actual number in complex plane when you're dealing with what's called Hilbert.
Hilbert space.
Hilbert space, and you're dealing with the North Pole of a Riemann sphere.
Riemann sphere.
So in the North Pole of a Riemann sphere, complex infinity is considered to be a complex number, right? But that's on the complex plane. Now, granted, all reals are a subset of complex, which a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around. But anyway, side project there. So by the way, I'm still trying to look up what that damn word is.
Let me know if this plane I need to meet. Yikes.
It's not transitive. It's not the transitive property. It's right on the tip of my tongue. It just bothers me.
Sorry about that. Plane going over my house.
And I'm surprised all these people in math. What's the word that if it holds true for the reals, it has to hold true for the hyperreals? And I know it starts with a T, but it's not transitive. It's because of the Oh, what property is this? Oh my God! Don't you hate it when you know something? Well, you don't actually know it because you can't remember it. Do you actually know something? It is
You
true, and I
don't
believe that it's true,
know
and I
that
can
you know.
justify it. But how do you know if you don't remember it? Do you actually know? It's in the
It's
brain
not a
here
current
somewhere.
belief.
Oh
That's
my
awesome.
God, this drives me nuts.
You're gonna know immediately after you stop the
Oh
program.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
gonna
As soon as I
pop right
find it, I'll be
in.
like, damn it, I hate myself. I'm an idiot. I'm never gonna go on air ever again. I've embarrassed myself in front of well, it's normally thousands of people. It's there's only be a few hundreds of people. Subs have been down all over the place. Watch has been
Thousands.
down all over the place. I usually get like 2 to 3 thousand views per video. Now it's been like
That's
500 or
awesome.
1,000. But I'm not the only one. I'm telling you right now, every content creator out there has been bitching about this. In every group that I've seen, people are just like,
Oh, really?
people are not getting. People actually tag YouTube on Twitter. I know one person actually tagged it and said, "Hey, I'm not getting any views and subs, and I'm not people. My subscribers are not
Hmm.
getting notifications, and I'm not getting notifications." And YouTube actually wrote back and said, "Yeah, we know the problem."
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah, crazy times right now.
yeah. So what else did you think of the discussion? What other kind of things that you want to bring up on it?
Oh, let me think.
Because I definitely think that
Trying to
was one of the
think of
biggest
what.
things on that particular issue is on that. Do you count every single
Oh,
marble? Because I just don't. It doesn't follow.
yeah, I do think, and I remember when I first was talking to Alex about this on Google Plus. I do think Craig has kind of a point in that one of the symmetry breakers, when you introduce tense uh, between beginninglessness and endlessness, is this idea that tense, a tensed theory of time, is committed to this idea that there is not, temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality. Now, however you want to cash that out and assimilate it into different theories in physics, I think that's totally cool. That's up to the philosophers of physics. Um, but I do think that it does commit you to the idea that the past is not growing in the earlier than direction. I think that is a key symmetry breaker because if time is growing in the later than direction and it's not growing in the earlier than direction, and Craig brought up those medieval distinctions between actuality and existence, or actuality, a sufficient condition for actuality is that for something had to actually exit its cause for it to be a part of actuality. So
Okay,
there's
so
actually this
okay, so
dynamic idea.
potentiality in Aristotelian, you would have a potentiality, right? And then for it to become actualized, you have to have uh, effect that came from an actual cause.
A particular kind of potential, cash that out however you want. Don't
Okay.
ontologically commit yourself to potentialities or whatever, but these descriptions that satisfy whatever it is we're talking about when we talk about potentialities. If there was a part of that potentiality that was actualized, it is now a part of the actual world, even if it's non-existent. So Craig's a presentist, and if you read an essay called "Taking Tense Seriously," when he responds to Wes Morriston on this, at first, this is his first response to this kind of idea with the singing angels and all that stuff. Um, he does bring that up. He brings up, and it's an actual distinction, even in the metaphysics of modality. This distinction between existence and actuality. That actuality is kind of like it's not like being pregnant almost. You can actually kind of have a part of reality that is actual but non-existent, whereas if something is non-existent, it just doesn't exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
So the future is not actual and non-existent, but
Uh,
the past for the president would be actual and
so
non-existent.
as a presentist, he holds that the only thing that does exist is the now,
That
because
actuality is
the
exhausted by the now,
the
right?
exactuality exhausts by
The
now.
only
So
objects that exist are present
okay,
objects.
and so
Exactly.
anything that existed in the past no longer has any persistence. It does not exist any longer.
Does not exist, even though
Although
it's now part of the actual world.
but now powers the actual. But there are other theories of time, and there's other types of
Right, well,
philosophical
yeah,
positions that the present, the future, and the past do exist
yeah,
with a simultaneity of sorts that something that
yes.
existed in the past always will exist as a persistence. It's just not actualized now, right in the present,
Yeah,
but
it's difficult because they're committed to four dimensionalism, so they don't think
well,
that
like
there's
growing,
three dimensional
growing block
objects
theory.
persisting through time. Growing block theory, right? So yeah, so if you look at the past in a growing block, now the past is existent, and you can have these like things you can analyze out of that block in terms of us, which are just space-time blocks. We would just be space-time blocks beginning in 1901 and ending in 1943, let's say. Let's just construe it tenselessly. And then you have these space-time blocks, and there they are. They're in the past, but there was no future in which you were embedded with the growing block theory. Now, you do have theories where you're ontologically committed to the present and the future and not the past. These are called shrinking tree theories. They're actually held by a couple different philosophers. I know it's a minority among atheorists, but yeah, it's called shrinking tree, and they're committed to the present and the future, but not the past. So maybe you could, if you motivate that, you could actually motivate time travel to the future, but not the past.
Well, and I kind of hold that. I think that you can actually go as far as you want in the future, but that's only because of relativity. But I don't think you can go in the backwards in the past,
Right,
time-wise.
exactly.
Now, this is when people have asked, like when I use different propositions for like the God argument, right? And I try to make it as simple as possible, but I do understand the distinctions. But a lot of I just say, look, a God exists. That's a very simple, basic preposition for theism. But then you have somebody out there, well, does that mean that if you believe that a God existed and he doesn't now? I'm like, look, just assume B theory of time. Just assume that the past, present, and future all still exist in some capacity. That way you get around that problem. Because I think it's a very stupid, silly counter argument to say, well, I believe there's a God that created everything, but he died and no longer exists. Okay, you're still a theist to me. It doesn't have to be that you're in this actualized present state that even though he doesn't no longer exist, for the sake of the argument, right? Now, if somebody asks, does Tyrannosaurus Rex exist? No, they no longer exist. We're not. We're talking in a small, narrow scope. We're not talking about a broad metaphysical sense, right? If you're asking me in B theory of time as a presentist, I would say that then yes, they still continue to exist in that scope, right? So I mean, I think these types of really silly arguments when people say, well, that doesn't make you a theist then. If you just say God exists, you need to be more specific in your proposition. That just bloats the whole argument, right? And so I don't think I don't like getting into those types of nuanced discussions. I know other people find it fascinating to say, well, what about if you believe that God existed but no longer? Yeah. Does it really make frickin' a difference? To me, if you think there was a metaphysical being that existed, that created something that can prescriptively change the laws of the universe, I'm going to throw that into theist, whether that God exists or not. I'm sorry. To me, that is how we contextualize these conversations. But what we
Sounds like finite godism. Finite godism, where you could actually have contingent existence, I guess.
Not all gods have to be metaphysically either necessary or even have.
Swinburne doesn't even think the Christian God is metaphysically necessary.
Well, I mean, it depends on the version of the Christian God. I mean, Plantinga would argue completely otherwise, right? Plantinga
the history has to be. Exactly. Yeah. The history of philosophy of religion, you can trace it back to Plantinga and Swinburne, and there's kind of this kind of like divergence in the wood kind of thing.
That would be awesome.
They have different approaches.
When did Swinburne die?
Swinburne is still alive.
Is he still alive? I thought he was dead. I don't think he's still alive. He's old. Is Swinburne still alive? I thought he was passed.
Swinburne is still alive. Yeah, he's still going strong.
Have they ever discussed this particular topic together?
They had to have, because they've been at conferences together. Everybody's friends. It's kind of like it's just camaraderie of it. I like it. Everybody's everybody's friends.
Work on his
we all hug it out at the end.
Yay! But it's so funny too. Again, we get into tribalism, and people hate to give credit to any apologists. But like for Plantinga, the first parts of his theodicies, I think, actually make some sense, right? For the evidential problem of evil. I think he jumps the shark at some point, right? But I do give credit where credit is due. He does have a decent theodicy against natural evil. But so does Wick with, soul building exercise. But, you eventually reach a point where you have to go, okay, where does your theodicy then end with me? And Plantinga, I think, jumps the shark because he starts involving Adam and Eve at some point.
Yeah, he does do that. What makes planning, I think, underappreciated, and I think this story needs to be told more often, is that in the 50s and 60s, modality was considered voodoo. Nobody liked it. Quine could not stand it, and Carnap tried to provide a semantics of logical syntax that would actually be able to provide sufficient paraphrases for modal talk. But what happened is in the mid 60s is that people started to object. People like Barkin and I forget the other people. Kripke. Kripke was a main player in this. But once Quine's critique of empiricism went through, and Kripke, Barkin et al. Critiqued Quine's critique of modality, this opened the floodgates to the metaphysics of modality. This is why metaphysics is a flourishing discipline, because of the work done in the late 60s in response to Quine's skepticism about modality and possible worlds and stuff like that. Well, what happened was Alvin Plantinga was one of the main players in that shift in the metaphysics of modality, which opened the floodgates to metaphysics. Now, what are religions? I mean, religions are basically, if you could boil it down to something, is a position that has a set of ontological commitments. What's ontology? It's a branch of metaphysics. So once you motivate metaphysics, the floodgates are open for a philosophy of religion. That they are open. So there was this renaissance in the 60s after logical positivism just ran rampant over metaphysics.
There's a resurgence of that, by the way, and I think that
there's a resurgence.
I blame that on the atheist community. I see a lot of atheists, even though they don't call it that.
Right.
I see a lot of logical positivism.
It's not positivism. It's not positivism, so far as I could see. It's different kinds of scientism, and it's scientism.
But I would argue, I would disagree with you. I would argue, I agree with your scientism. There are a handful of people, the way they have argued, like I've seen Aaron Ra do this, argue as a logical positivist, even though he won't accept that.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I know the atheists do that, but like what I've seen the most from a lot of atheists is an unfamiliarity with meta philosophy. It's just a study of the philosophical discipline itself. And once you do that, you come to know about these stories, what happened in the 60s when it transitioned. Which
I don't get into, by the way. Meta philosophy is not a topic. Right. I don't read a lot about the history of this stuff, and I probably should.
It's fascinating.
Cursory. I'm sure it would be.
It's very interesting.
I like the concepts themselves. And so I like reading about the concepts, but I don't like care where they came from, the predecessors, the way that they were, the different manifestations of these arguments, because they're all basically distilled from other things. Right? They're all divisive.
They're distilled from other things. Yeah. There's different ways to carry it out and stuff like that. I definitely don't read history for the sake of history. I read history because history is a minefield of concepts.
Oh, by the way, I found the word I was looking for.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, it's called.
What is it?
It's and now, you know what I'm. By the way, before I even say it, I'm thinking to myself, God, I'm stupid. You know, I knew this. It's something that I've written about. It's called the dichotomy property.
Okay, so it didn't even start with a T. No, we were on the wrong set. Yeah. But yeah. So if you trace back exactly the kinds of methods that Plantinga uses in his theodicies and stuff like that, they are firmly rooted in the same strategies that were used to transition away from Quine to possible robust metaphysics.
Actually, I'm wrong again. The trichotomy property goes. I'm screwed up.
Oh, trichotomy. I think it's
trichotomy is actually if that's actually something we talked about before. X less than y, x is greater than y, x is equal to y, right? So it's either the case that a is x is less than. So that's a property I was thinking of, but that's not what I was talking about for the surreals. Or is the hyperreals related to real? So I'm confused here. So yeah, the trichotomy property was the property I was trying to think of. If you only have the conditions that either x is less than y, x is greater than y, or x is equal to y for the reals, and you have to divide by 2. That's the trichotomy. But I still have to figure out what the property is for if it holds true for the reals, it has to hold true for the hyperreals. I'm going to say transitive property, but that's not what it is, because that's not transitivity. So I don't remember, people. Where's Landon when you need him? Somebody asked me.
Landon, come back.
We have entire world's knowledge at our database at our disposal. I can never find what I'm freaking looking for.
Hey Siri.
Cortana won't know. She'll laugh at me.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Sorry.
Could you?
I'm still trying to figure it out. But anyways, okay. I just really pisses me off that I wish I could remember this freaking term. But there is a property that says that if it's true in the reals, it has to hold true in the hyperreals. It tells you how long I looked at hyperreals. It's been about 3 years for non-standard analysis.
It's hard. Stuff.
Well, you remember I used to do a lot with that whole point 9 repeating one, because I use that as a litmus test. I like things that are not veridical paradoxes. I mean, I like veridical paradoxes, but I like things that are actually shock the senses, right? Because people think it's counterintuitive that 0.99 equals 1.
This is the first thing we ever talked about.
I think
actually,
it was back 7, 8
since
years
we
ago.
met.
So you remember this. I have not changed, but I use this as a litmus test because if a person does not or is unwilling to grasp that this is a mathematical fact, they are unwilling to grasp anything because this is something that is objectively the case, right? And this to me is what tells me if they have the epistemic property of open-mindedness and virtue epistemology,
Okay.
right? Because if they're going to say, look, the math is wrong, I'm smarter than everybody else on the planet, then I don't think they're very open-minded, right? A true skeptic would say, hey, look, and I'm not talking about skepticism and philosophy. I'm going to be using colloquial, but just what they consider to be a skeptic, ordinary doubt. A person would say, yeah, show me the evidence. Hey, look, I'm not a mathematician, but if the world's mathematicians say this, and I'm not that familiar with this particular subject, I'm probably going to think that they're probably right, and I don't know enough to argue against it. Maybe I should learn the topic. But to say that all the mathematicians are wrong and have such hubris, even though they clearly don't know the topic, that to me is somebody that I find to be a very dishonest interlocutor, and I probably don't waste a lot of time with them.
It could be either dishonesty or just years and years of sublimating different levels of self-deception. Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, they think
they don't have metacognitive abilities.
Yeah, they just they'll show me some math, and I'm like, by the way, back in the day, whenever I had somebody argue against that, I always knew who they were quoting, because I knew the guy that they were quoting, and he's a jackass. But you're quoting somebody who's not actually even a real mathematician. Sometimes they quoted what's his name? Oh my God, Nilberger.
Wildberger, okay.
I forget his name, but he's a finitist, right? So he's a mathematical constructivist that creates finite type things. He has mathematical systems which eliminates things like rational numbers, which is perfectly fine to do. You could be a constructivist and you can have a mathematical framework that eliminates rational numbers as a finitist, but they're seeing his work. What is it, MJ? I think it's MJ Wildberger. Is that his name? God,
MJ. Another MJ. Sweet.
I think so. Or NJ. But they're not recognizing that he never states that for the reals that there are no irrational numbers, right? He recognizes that in the real analytics this is the case, but he argues other forms of mathematics that's not necessarily the case by just having different axioms, right? Constructivism, which he's perfectly allowed to do. Anyways, these guys quote this one guy, and I can't think of his name right now, but he has actually put himself up for like the Nobel Prize or something, and the Hugo Award, or not Hugo Award, the Fields Medal. He thinks you have to be actually like recommended for the Fields Medal, right? You can't nominate yourself, and he thinks he's the greatest calculus person in the entire world, and for like decades, I guess he's been promoting this new calculus, and he's gotten no traction whatsoever because anybody who's ever looked at his math goes, he's just wrong. I mean, he's just wrong. But I don't remember his name. I'm having a hard time with brain farts today. Who came up with the new calculus? Maybe you might remember the name. It was John Gabriel. That was his name.
That does sound familiar, actually.
Yeah. And so whenever they quote anybody that was like, 0.99 they've always got it from the New Calculus by John Gabriel. And just to give you an idea of this guy's hubris, right? He's like, let's see here. Let's see what he writes here. At the very end, I think it is. He actually just puts himself on like the greatest mathematician on the planet.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Good for him.
Yeah.
Fortune favors the bold.
Okay. Maybe I don't remember on his page where he says it, but he says that he thinks he should earn the Fields Medal.
I just think of Good Will Hunting immediately. The Fields Medal, the Fields Medal.
Yeah, he says the new calculus is the greatest feat of human intellectual accomplishment. It is the first and only rigorous formation of calculus in human history. Not worth 1, but 10 Abel prizes. Given that no one before me was able to realize it. You can be certain that the Church of Academia, mainstream academia, has its way. I shall never receive any prizes, never mind 1 Abel prize. Mainstream academics hate me passionately and are pathologically jealous of my work. They have persecuted me in many ways, and on 5 occasions they have shut down my previous sites through libel, falsely claiming that I'm an anti-Semite. Reports and lies and actual death threats. They have tried to shut down my YouTube channel, and I set up countless websites liably defaming my character, whilst at the same time casting doubt on my brilliant work through lies and misrepresentation.
It's a misrepresentation on many forums. Yeah.
Sounds like Trump, right? This guy is a legend in his own freaking mind. Math is objective, people. He has spent hours and years on forums convincing people of this new calculus. And by the way, some of this stuff isn't wrong. It's just not right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
He's just all he's doing in some cases is he's just setting up a framework and eliminating certain. He's incorporating certain infinitesimals, but that's not the way it works for the reals, right? So you can do constructivist mathematics, but this guy thinks he's like have this rigorous formation of calculus by making it far more complicated than if you look at his math. But he's just ridiculous.
Sounds like a blast, though.
It sounds a lot like
go hang out with in the bar.
Edgar. Mr. Intelligent Design thought he was just like the geniuses of all geniuses.
The drunker I get, the more humble I get.
Oh my goodness.
Humble serum.
So, anyways, I did invite Nick Suter to come in, but he hasn't joined us yet.
Okay, good. I was about to say I got about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know you got to wrap it up, and it's a little late we ran a little late today, and I apologize. But you know what? I think we got a lot out on this particular discussion.
It's kind of my fault though, because I gave you the time.
No, it's
cool.
Like yesterday, like I said, we couldn't get into some of this stuff that I wanted to talk about of the review of the debate that I had questions on, because yesterday we were stuck in math mode, right? And we were trying to explain. Right. What a set was, what a bijection is. What is a one-to-one correspondence to the natural numbers?
Yep.
What is alpha? No, and I wanted to get those basic things out because, again, if we're going to talk about actualities and we can talk about infinities and we're going to talk about cardinalities, if people don't know what alpha null is, they're not going to understand this particular topic. And I think listening to Malpass and Craig, why I liked debates, people know that. One thing I don't like about debates is when you just have two people talking to each other, like we are. Right. I don't like this kind of format without explaining to people, and that's why I stop. And I want the outside to understand what we're talking about. Because if you and I just talk about this stuff and we're not explaining it to anybody, what's the point? That's not what I'm here for. I
do hear you. I hear you on that, and I like that. I think that's a virtue. However, I do like it when. Have you ever listened to Eric Weinstein's Portal, his podcast? Mm-hmm. Okay, it is awesome. Plug. He invites, like, for example, he invited Roger Penrose on his show, and they're talking about gauge theory, spinners, higher level theoretical physics. I mean, he has a really good guest on his show. And what he tries to do with the portal is, you could explain things every once in a while, but he wanted to give his listeners the impression of eavesdropping in the master's common room. Like, what does it sound like when two academics are just talking? And they're not trying to I'm not saying you're saying this, but when there's some time that's kind of wasted when you kind of flatten everything out to like the level of like a 5-year-old understanding. You're not saying that, but one of his points was, let's do an experiment and let's just not insult the intelligence. Not to say that you're saying that. I'm not saying that. Not insult the intelligence of our audience and just talk. Let's just talk shop. And they're kind of like, they come in voluntarily and they listen in, and what they can do is they can pause, they can rewind, they can look up key terms while they're doing it. And it just gives the opportunity to the two academics to just free flow, have a conversation about whatever topic they're talking about in the way they would talk about it in the office at a university. And it's just a really cool experiment he's doing.
I would love that too, by the way. Don't get me wrong. That's something I would like. I'm not saying that I don't per se.
But I do see your point. Yeah. I see your point, though. Yeah.
But there's also like two medical people talking to each other. Medical terminology is completely different as well, right?
That's not near as interesting as what we talk about, though. I'm just kidding. We're way more interesting than them. Unless it's Dr. House. Right. Unless it's Dr. House. You Lorries.
I prefer to, like I said, to have the conversations where they're explanatory. Now, I'm going to ask the audience if they can find out what the property is that whatever holds for the reals, the hyperreals. Leave it in the comment section. Now, there is something called the Weierstrass theorem, where our arithmetical expressions and formulas, and I'm reading this right now, not top of my head. It says all arithmetical expressions and formulas make sense for the hyperreals and hold true if they are true for the ordinary reals. Okay, but they're actually the name for that property. I can't find it on a wiki right now, so if you find it, let me know.
Quantumtivity.
It starts with a. I'm pretty sure it starts with a T, but I just can't for the life. I haven't looked into hyperreals in a very long time, but I do remember that the conditions that it was able to be. It's trans something, I think, but it's basically saying that if it holds true here, it has to hold true as here. It can't.
I guess I could bring up this right before I go to illustrate.
I got it. I got it.
What is it?
Transfer principle.
Transfer. Is that it?
Woo! Woo! I don't need you, live chat.
I thought it was going to be like this 10-syllable word, man.
I don't need you, live chat. I don't need my subscribers. I don't need my listeners. Damn it! See these. By the way, I have the worst minions on the planet because people think I have like these thousands of minions and stuff like that. Yet they don't do a goddamn thing for me when I ask. They're like, Steve. So I love them for in that regard. But yeah, anybody that thinks I have the ability to control anybody to do anything, you're so practically wrong.
That's weird.
You
said fractally? Fractally wrong?
You're fractally wrong. I don't have a damn person that'll do anything for me. I have to beg for half the crap. And even then, they're like, what's in it for me? Oh no, I'm kidding. I love my live chat, and usually they do at least try to show me up and go, "Hey, Steve didn't know this, but I did," which is great. But anyways, I know you got to go.
Can I bring up
Pikachu?
Can I bring up that one more point?
Yes, please.
Just that one more point because it touched upon that one thing we were talking about.
Okay.
The modal operator shift or whatever. Mm-hmm. I did like that Tristram Shandy paradox that Craig brought up, which it seemed like Alex was on board with because it's supposed to motivate the idea that the modal operator shift is fallacious. Tristram Shandy is a paradox from Bertrand Russell where he said it takes somebody a year to record a day in their life. So you can put a one-to-one correspondence between the days and the years, right? And so you have this bijection. Unfortunately, because this is what's called a super task, right? It paradoxically can't be done because the more progress he makes, the more he gets behind on his task.
Sure.
But it doesn't follow from that there is not a day that Tristram Shandy will not eventually record. But because that's true, it doesn't follow that Tristram Shandy can complete his entire autobiography. It's the same kind of modal operator shift. So the days or the years where he completes a day in his autobiography have a particular property, but his autobiography as a whole has another kind of property. And it would be the fallacy of composition to say that because all the days can be recorded in the year that it takes for him to record it, it would be modally fallacious to say that the autobiography as a whole, I can't say it, can therefore be recorded. I think that's a good analogy to the super tasks. Exactly.
Yeah.
I do want to know why Benedarte, I forget his name, but it was the book, the first page of which is 1/2 inch, the second page is 1/4 inch, and you have these unequal intervals that are represented by the pages. And what happens when you turn over the book? And he said there would be this invisible barrier. But Alex mentioned that this guy actually does believe in the metaphysical possibility of an actual infinite. That would be interesting to get into whether or not that leads into, I'll call it metaphysical absurdism instead of existential.
Okay, yeah, because that differentiates the two. I like that better.
Stipulative.
Because I take existential absurdism to be a very specific thing. Because
right. And Kierkegaard's my favorite philosopher, so we can talk about that. Yeah.
By the way, I had a really
that's actually a mistranslation of the Danish. It's actually Kierkegaard's one of my favorite philosophers. It's actually a leap into faith.
Yes, I'm aware of that. Yeah, leap into faith was a translation, but what he meant by that, and I pointed this out the other day, and a lot of people thought it was because they didn't understand that what it was. By the way, he was in love with somebody. You know the story, but anyways, but he was saying was not don't just have blind faith in God. It wasn't a leap of faith. Hey, believe God. It was a leap of faith that to try to justify absurdism that his quest or man's quest to find meaning in life is met by the resistance of there is nothing to be had by the universe that has any intrinsic value or anything like that. So there's this constant tension between those two, and sometimes you just have to. He said you have to embrace the irrational sometimes
Hmm.
as a way to escape this
And it was a
problem.
particular way to understand irrationality
Yeah, I
within a
called it
Hegelian
philosophical
context.
suicide.
Well, in the Hegelian context, in
In
the
the Hegelian
dialectical
context,
context,
that's
exactly.
by the way, Hegel can go suck up. Yeah, never mind.
I think he
Nobody
gets a
likes
bad
Hegel.
rap. I do understand why
Nobody
people
likes
don't
Hegel.
like him, but he's actually not that bad.
Whatever. But I still think, I mean,
But I have
the
some
type of
German blood in
philosophical
me, so
suicide is to say we're going to, I get where he's coming from, by the way. I mean, like I said, to accept the irrational as a way to get out of that problem. He's not wrong on that. It is a one possible way to do it, but at what cost? But anyways, we're going to have
I
a whole
think
thing on
with
Kierkegaard
Hegel,
one of these days. That'd be great.
with Hegel though, I would say that the parts are greater than the whole. There's certain passages
I
in the
don't. I
phenomenology that
tried
I
reading his
feel are
dialectics, and I'm telling you,
very
it's just
meaningful. Oh, really?
yeah,
Don't dive right in. You got to get some Cambridge
dude.
companions,
I was going to say
some black companions.
I'm low man on the totem pole, man. I'm still working on like the basics. Okay, after 6 years, I'm not
You're
going to
not.
dive
Not
into
true.
Hegelian
Man.
dialectics that much. But anyways, thanks MJ for joining us on Ask a Philosopher. I tried getting Nick in, but I don't know where he's at. I gave him a link. But tonight, just to let you guys know, we have Wayne Fillmore back. You guys remember him? He was the theist that at one time was talked about by Jacqueline Glenn, and then he changed his position because, well, he's still a theist, but he's not a young Earth creationist any longer because I had a debate with him on macroevolution a couple years ago. He recognized the fact that I was right, and he just completely rejected young Earth creationism after that. He's been fighting against it ever since. He'll be on with a guy named Christopher Salvis tonight, which is a younger creationist I've known for a very long time. They want to talk about Bible stuff, and then I guess later on in the next couple of days, Jackson Week, if you guys know him, well, my listeners do. You may not remember Jackson Week, but Jackson Week is a brilliant biologist dude. He just understands like phylogeny better than pretty much anybody, maybe next to Aaron. But he's going to be talking to Christopher on the fossil record. So we are getting back into some of that stuff again because we're still waiting for the non sequitur show to come back, as you know. Some movement on that hopefully in the next day or so. By the way, good stuff on that. But in the interim, I want to go back to what I was doing years ago, and I want to get back into some of that debunking young creationist stuff. So, okay. So what do you got for us? Last
Yes,
words
sir.
and promote your shit, and let's get the hell out of here.
Yeah, as far as like the link, I'm not sure how to do that. I guess you could put it in the description if you want to. No
Yeah, just send it to
pressure.
me. I'll put it in the
But
video
you,
description.
you basically just go to YouTube and type in "Democracy of the Dead." It's a quotation from G.K. Chesterton talking about we don't want to just go along with the opinion of people that happen to be alive. Let's consult everybody that has ever existed. I like that. I like
Yeah,
that
well, that makes
Catholic
sense
kind of
too. We look back on that. By the way, I've got.
right.
Let's see here. I'm trying to find your channel here. Democracy of the Dead. I see Democracy is Dead, which is probably true. I don't want to play music. Democracy is.
Democracy of the Dead.
I see it. I got it. Got it. Perfect. Oh my God. Oh, you actually got 41 whole subscribers. I'm amazed. No, I've just subscribed to you now. Actually, there we go. I just got notifications. So that's the link.
And I think we'll be making a video tomorrow. So there was a long gap,
Here's the goal.
but we're coming back.
Because again, I got half the people watching now is normally because of YouTube and this V stuff, the CV stuff.
Yeah.
It's been bad all over, but I will try to get you subs to get you to 50.
Yeah, that's all I want. Okay. Then I can die happy.
Usually I'll go for much higher expectations, but I'm a little bit hesitant right now. Okay.
I did not endorse MJ. What are you talking about? I don't even know him.
It is in the video description now. There we go. It is in the link. Go subscribe to him. Let's get him to 50. Yay. All right. Good night, guys. See you guys tonight. It's going to be at 6 o'clock tonight with Wayne Fillmore. Give him a shake. And by the way, I'm just kind of hosting it. I don't know anything about the Bible, really, and I don't really care to. I don't even know. I think it's discussing infallibility of the Bible or inerrancy, right? And there's a difference between infallible and inerrancy, but one says that the Bible has no errors. The other says it can't have any errors. I don't think either are true. I don't think the Bible's I don't think at all the Bible's inerrant, nor do I think it's infallible. But that's my position. I think Chris is going to argue that it is. But anyways, MJ, good seeing you again, buddy. We'll catch up more now that you've got some free time, and I hope that you like doing this. I do ask a
the coronavirus brought us together,
man.
He
said the word. We are demonetized. Send a $2.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah.
No.
Yeah, if you say it, yeah. But you know what? Almost all my
everything.
videos get demonetized nowadays. It's ridiculous. Cheshire is the only one that gets monetized videos nowadays. It's sexist. It's I think it's the matriarchy coming back to bite us that her videos get monetized and mine don't. Damn you, YouTube. Damn you. All right, I'm out, guys. Good night. See you guys tonight. Peace.
Bye, everybody.